At the funeral, a canine German Shepherd jumped onto the body of the soldier. What happened next was shocking and emotional. The scene was heartbreaking. The heavy silence, the overcast sky, the soldiers standing in formation with solemn respect. The flag-draped coffin represented the loss of a hero, but for one special member of that ceremony, none of it made sense. Max, a canine German Shepherd trained for combat, stood motionless, his eyes locked onto the coffin. His partner, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, would never return. And when the bugle played taps and the soldiers gave their final salute, Max did something no one expected. What happened next was both shocking and deeply emotional, leaving everyone in tears. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. This helps us bring more powerful and emotional stories like this to you. Now, let's get into it. The sky was a deep shade of gray, heavy with unshed rain, as if the heavens themselves were mourning the loss of a hero. A sharp wind cut through the cemetery, rustling the rows of American flags planted in the grass. Soldiers in crisp uniforms stood in silent formation, their expressions unreadable, but their grief was palpable. At the center of it all lay the casket, draped in red, white, and blue. It rested on a raised platform, waiting for its final descent. It was supposed to be a moment of solemn dignity, a farewell worthy of a man who had given everything for his country. But then, something happened that no one expected. Max, a canine German Shepherd, sat at the foot of the casket, his large frame rigid, his ears pricked forward in alertness. His handler, Sergeant Daniel Brooks, had been everything to him: his protector, his partner, his world. Max had been trained to obey, to remain composed in the face of gunfire, explosions, and chaos. But now he was faced with something that no amount of training could prepare him for: the absence of Daniel. For the past few days, Max had been restless. He had waited by the door, expecting Daniel to return, expecting his voice to call him for duty. When they brought him to the funeral, he had strained against the leash, searching, sniffing, trying to find his handler. And now, as he sat in front of the casket, something inside him snapped. The silence was broken by the slow, mournful notes of taps, the trumpet's haunting melody echoing through the cemetery. The honor guard lifted their rifles for the 21-gun salute, their movements precise, rehearsed. The first shot rang out. Max flinched, but his eyes never left the casket. The second shot, his body tensed. The third. And then, he moved. Without warning, Max lunged forward, breaking free from the loose grip of the soldier holding his leash. Gasps rippled through the crowd as the massive German Shepherd leaped onto the casket, his paws scraping against the polished wood. And then, he laid down on it. A deep, guttural whine escaped from his throat, a sound so raw, so filled with agony that it sent chills through every person present. He pressed his body tightly against the casket, as if trying to get closer, as if willing Daniel to wake up. The funeral had followed every protocol, every rule, until now. Several soldiers exchanged uneasy glances. One took a step forward, hesitant, as if to remove the dog, but an older officer raised a hand, stopping him. "Let him be," the officer murmured. Daniel's mother, a woman who had kept a strong face throughout the entire service, let out a choked sob. She had watched her son grow into a soldier, had accepted the risks, but nothing had prepared her for the sight of his loyal companion refusing to let go. Max let out another painful whimper, nudging the casket with his nose. His breaths were shallow, his body trembled, but he wouldn't move. And then, something even more shocking happened. Max's tail, which had been motionless, gave a small, hopeful wag. His ears flicked forward in recognition. He had heard something. The crowd held its breath. Was it the wind, a distant sound, or something else entirely? Max let out a soft bark, his tail wagging again. His body language had changed. Not just grief now, but expectation. He was waiting for Daniel to call him one last time. But the voice never came. As the realization settled in, Max's ears drooped, his tail fell still, and he let out a deep, broken sigh. His head rested on the casket, his eyes dull, lifeless. He wasn't just mourning. He was giving up. Tears flowed freely among the soldiers, among Daniel's family, among hardened men and women who had seen the worst of war. No one had words for what they had just witnessed. And yet, deep down, everyone understood. This wasn't just a dog grieving his handler. This was a soldier mourning his partner. The air remained thick with silence, broken only by the occasional sniffles of those who could no longer hold back their grief. Max stayed motionless on the casket, his body pressed tightly against it, as if he believed that if he held on hard enough, he could stop the inevitable. But the funeral had to continue. A soldier from the honor guard, a tall man with a strong build, finally stepped forward, his gloved hands reaching carefully toward Max. His voice was soft, almost apologetic. "Come on, boy. It's time." But Max didn't move. He let out a deep whimper, low and mournful, refusing to obey a command that went against everything in his heart. His world had always been about following orders, but this was something else. This was love. The soldier hesitated, his eyes betraying his own pain. How could he force Max away when the dog was only doing what every person in that crowd wished they could do? Daniel's mother, seated in the front row, wiped her tears and took a shaky breath. Slowly, she knelt beside the casket, reaching out a trembling hand to touch Max's fur. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, her voice breaking. Max turned his head slightly, acknowledging her, but he didn't move away. If anything, he pressed himself even closer to the casket. His entire body seemed to deflate, as if the weight of reality was finally settling over him. A pastor, who had been silently waiting for the service to continue, cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of the moment. "We gather here today to honor a brave man who—" Max let out a sharp, broken howl. The sound cut through the cemetery, raw and filled with an unbearable sorrow that no human words could ever express. It sent a wave of shivers through every person present. The pastor fell silent. A few soldiers lowered their heads. Some clenched their fists, holding back tears. A young officer, barely out of his 20s, turned away, pressing his sleeve to his face. Daniel's mother gasped softly, her hand going to her chest, as if the sound had physically wounded her. And then, as if realizing that his cry had done nothing, that Daniel still wasn't coming back, Max let out a deep, shaky breath and closed his eyes. His breathing slowed. His body trembled, then went still. "Is he okay?" a soldier murmured. A veterinarian had been standing by, in case Max needed medical attention. She knelt beside him, placing gentle fingers on his side, checking his heartbeat. The moment she touched him, her lips pressed into a thin line. It was faint, too faint. She looked up, eyes filled with quiet devastation. "He's shutting down." A stunned silence fell over the crowd. "He's giving up," she whispered. Somewhere in the distance, the wind shifted, rustling the American flag atop the casket. Daniel's mother clutched Max's fur, shaking her head. No, please, baby. Stay with us." But Max wasn't responding anymore. His heartbeat was slow, weak, his chest barely rising. K9 handlers knew about this. They had seen it before. Some dogs, when faced with unbearable grief, simply stopped fighting. Their hearts, strong enough to withstand battle, weren't strong enough to endure the loss of the one person they loved most. Tears streamed freely now, down the faces of battle-hardened men and women who had seen death, who had lived through war. But nothing had prepared them for this. Max wasn't just grieving. He was dying of a broken heart. The vet pulled out a syringe from her bag, filled with a stimulant that could help his body fight the shutdown. She hesitated, looking at Daniel's mother. "I can try to stabilize him." But Daniel's mother knew the truth. Max didn't want to be saved. Her hands trembled as she gently cradled the dog's face, her tears falling onto his fur. "You don't have to fight anymore, baby. If you want to go, it's okay." The soldiers watched in stunned silence as one of their own made the ultimate choice, not to live in a world without the one he loved most. Max let out one final breath, soft and slow, as if sighing in relief. And then, he was gone. A heavy stillness fell over the cemetery. No one moved. No one spoke. Max had been more than just a military dog. He had been a soldier, a partner, a friend. And now, just like Daniel, he had given everything. The funeral that had begun as a tribute to one fallen hero had now become the resting place of two. Silence hung over the cemetery like a heavy fog. No one spoke. No one moved. The loss of Sergeant Daniel Brooks had already left a deep wound in the hearts of those gathered. But now, there was another loss to bear. Max, the canine German Shepherd who had served alongside Daniel, had taken his final breath atop his handler's casket. His body, once strong and disciplined, now lay still, as if it had always belonged there, as if this was exactly where he had chosen to be. The soldiers, men and women trained to endure the brutality of war, stood frozen, their eyes locked on the sight before them. No one had expected this. No one had prepared for it. A soldier near the front, Corporal James Miller, clenched his jaw and wiped his face quickly, as if ashamed of the tears spilling down his cheeks. But no one judged him, because every single person there was barely holding themselves together. Daniel's mother knelt beside Max's body, her hands cradling his fur as fresh sobs shook her frame. "Oh, sweetheart," she whispered, "you didn't have to go. You didn't have to leave too." The veterinarian, still gripping the syringe she had been ready to use, let out a shaky breath and placed it back in her medical bag. It was too late now. Max had made his choice. General Harris, a man who had served for over 30 years, stepped forward, his face unreadable. He was a man who had delivered countless eulogies, had stood at more gravesides than he cared to count. But this was different. Slowly, he lowered himself to one knee, placing a firm but gentle hand on Max's still body. "He was one of us," Harris said, his voice rough with emotion. "A soldier, and a damn good one." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the ranks, but the grief remained thick in the air. The honor guard, who had been waiting to continue the funeral, seemed uncertain of what to do. This had never happened before. How do you bury a soldier when his most loyal companion refuses to let him go? It was Daniel's younger sister, Emily, who finally spoke. Her voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. "They have to go together." Every head turned toward her. She swallowed hard, her eyes red and swollen from crying. Max was his partner, his best friend. He shouldn't be buried somewhere else, alone. He should be with Daniel. General Harris nodded slowly, his jaw tight. "I'll make the call." In normal circumstances, canine dogs were given their own resting place, honored with military tradition, but this was beyond protocol. Max had made his choice. And now, they had to honor it. As Harris stepped away to make the necessary arrangements, the soldiers moved into action. This was no longer just a funeral for Sergeant Daniel Brooks. It was a farewell to two heroes. 2 flags would be folded today. 2 names would be engraved in the memorial. 2 souls would rest together beneath the same stone. The cemetery workers who had come to lower Daniel's casket into the ground were given new instructions. A second space would be dug, right beside him. The weight of that decision settled over the mourners like a fresh wave of grief. Max was no ordinary military dog. He had not simply followed orders, he had loved truly and deeply. And when that love was taken from him, he had chosen to follow. A young private standing near the back whispered, "I've never seen anything like this before." Another soldier shook his head. "We probably never will again." Daniel's mother pressed a final kiss to Max's head, her tears soaking into his fur. "You take care of him now, okay? Wherever you're going." The honor guard repositioned themselves, their rifles lifted again in solemn tribute. This time, the shots fired weren't just for Daniel but for Max as well. The sound echoed through the cemetery, a final salute to a loyalty that had defied even death. And as the last note of taps faded into the wind, one thing became clear to everyone present. This was not just a funeral. This was the end of a love story. The preparations for the burial had changed. What was supposed to be a ceremony honoring one fallen soldier had become a tribute to two. The weight of it pressed down on everyone present. Grave workers had been called back. A second resting place was being dug, right beside Sergeant Daniel Brooks. The American flag that had draped Daniel's casket was folded with care, and now another would be prepared for Max. The crowd stood still, watching as the honor guards adjusted their stance, waiting for the next order. But there was hesitation in the air. No one had done this before. There was no official protocol for burying a K9 alongside his handler in the same grave. And yet, no one questioned it. Daniel's mother stood beside her son's casket, her hands trembling. She had already lost him, already accepted the unbearable truth that he wasn't coming home. But when Max took his final breath, it was as if she had lost him all over again. She turned to General Harris, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you sure this is allowed?" Harris, a man who had seen war, loss, and more funerals than he cared to count, nodded firmly. "Some rules are meant to be broken." The honor guard prepared to proceed. The 21-gun salute had already been given, but now they needed to place Max where he belonged. Two soldiers approached his still body, carefully lifting him as if he were made of glass. Max's weight had been familiar in life, a warrior strong and disciplined, but now, in death, he felt small. As they carried him toward Daniel's casket, not a single person spoke. The grave was now complete. Two spaces side by side, ready to hold two souls that refused to be separated. Daniel had been buried with his military honors, his uniform, and the flag of his country. Max, too, would receive the same respect. A custom-made wooden box had been provided, not just a burial case, but a casket, because Max was not just a dog. He was a soldier. The honor guards placed him inside with the same care they had given Daniel. A folded American flag was draped over the top, and a single silver dog tag, Max's identification, was placed beside it. It was Daniel's younger sister, Emily, who stepped forward first. She placed her hand over the box, whispering something so softly that only she and Max would ever know the words. One by one, soldiers approached, each one removing their K9 patches from their uniforms and placing them inside. By the time the last soldier had stepped back, Max was surrounded by symbols of honor, loyalty, and respect. Daniel's mother placed her hand on Max's flag-covered form. Her voice was thick with tears. "Stay with him, sweetheart. He'll need you where he's going." Then, the burial began. Daniel's casket was lowered first. The reality of his loss settled in once more, and his mother clutched her chest, gasping as if the air had been stolen from her lungs. And then, Max was lowered right beside him. One final goodbye. As the first handful of earth was placed over them, a strong gust of wind blew through the cemetery, rustling the trees and lifting fallen leaves into the air. Some swore later that it was a sign, that somewhere, somehow, Daniel and Max were running together once more. A chaplain stepped forward, his voice steady but filled with emotion. Today, we lay to rest two heroes, one who gave his life for his country, and another who refused to live without him. May they find peace together side by side, as they always were. The funeral was over, but the story would never be forgotten. No one walked away from that cemetery unchanged. Somewhere in a world beyond this one, a soldier stood at attention, and beside him, a canine German Shepherd sat faithfully, waiting for the next command. And this time, Daniel wouldn't have to tell him to stay. Because Max was never leaving his side again, the cemetery had emptied. The soldiers, the officers, and the grieving family members had all walked away, leaving behind two resting places, side by side. One for Sergeant Daniel Brooks, the other for his loyal K9 partner, Max. But even as the earth settled over their graves, their story was far from over. News of the funeral spread quickly. A journalist who had attended the service, intending to write a brief report on the fallen soldier, found himself unable to shake what he had witnessed. A war dog that had chosen death over life without his handler? That wasn't just a story. It was a testament to the unbreakable bond between man and dog. Within hours, his article was published. The headline read, "He couldn't let go. A K9's heartbreaking final goodbye to his fallen soldier." It was raw, emotional, and deeply personal, and the world took notice. By the next morning, thousands of people had read it. By the end of the day, millions had. Social media erupted with tributes, people sharing their own stories of service dogs, fallen soldiers, and the pain of losing a companion who had meant everything. News stations picked up the story. A major network aired footage from the funeral showing Max laying on Daniel's casket, his final moments captured in a single heart-wrenching image. It was more than just grief. It was love, loyalty, and sacrifice. Messages flooded in from around the world. Letters, emails, phone calls. People who had never met Daniel or Max were deeply moved, sending condolences to the family and demanding that Max receive the same honors as a fallen soldier. And the military listened. Daniel's commanding officer, Colonel Reed, was the first to act. He stood in his office, watching the funeral footage play for what had to be the 10th time. He had been in the military for over 25 years. He had seen men die in battle, had lost friends and comrades, had buried his own soldiers, but he had never seen anything like Max. He picked up the phone and made a call. Within days, an announcement was made. Max was being posthumously awarded the Medal of Valor, the highest honor given to military service animals. Only a handful of K9s in history had ever received such recognition, but no one questioned whether Max deserved it. He had given his life in the purest act of devotion, by refusing to live without the man he loved. The ceremony was planned for the following week. Daniel's family was invited, along with every soldier who had served with him. The military wasn't just honoring Max. They were recognizing the bond between every handler and K9 who had ever gone into battle together. When Daniel's mother received the call, she wept. Not from sadness this time, but from a strange kind of comfort. Her son had died a hero, and now, so had Max. A week later, the military base held a ceremony unlike any before. At the front stood a large framed photograph of Daniel, his uniform crisp, his smile unwavering. And beside it, another frame, one of Max, captured in his prime, his amber eyes sharp and loyal. A general stepped forward, his voice steady yet filled with emotion. Sergeant Daniel Brooks served with honor and courage. His sacrifice will never be forgotten. But today, we also recognize another hero, a soldier with no words, but with the purest heart. A warrior who stood beside his handler in life and to leave him in death. Today, we honor Max. A soldier stepped forward, carrying a small velvet box. Inside, gleaming under the bright sunlight, lay the Medal of Valor. Daniel's mother reached out with trembling hands. Accepting the medal meant for a dog who had been more than just a canine, he had been family. Tears welled in the eyes of those gathered. This wasn't just a ceremony. This wasn't just a medal. This was a love story that had transcended life and death. And as the flags above the base swayed in the breeze, every soldier standing there knew Max's legacy would never fade. The world had not forgotten. Days after the ceremony, the story of Sergeant Daniel Brooks and Max continued to spread. News stations ran features on their bond, showing footage of their time in training, clips from past deployments, and the emotional moment at the funeral when Max had refused to leave his handler's side. The image of him lying atop Daniel's casket had become an unshakable symbol of loyalty, one that moved people across the world to tears. Letters continued pouring in. Strangers from across the country wrote to Daniel's family, offering their condolences and sharing their own experiences of loss. Some were military families who had lost loved ones in service. Others were canine handlers who knew the pain of saying goodbye to a partner who had saved their lives. Many had never met Daniel or Max, but they felt connected to their story, as if they had known them personally. At the military base where Daniel had been stationed, something remarkable happened. Soldiers who had once passed by the canine training facility without much thought now stopped to watch. They saw the handlers working tirelessly with their dogs, the drills, the commands, the discipline. But more than that, they saw the connection, the way a handler's voice could calm a restless canine, the way a dog's eyes never left his partner, always waiting for the next instruction, always ready to act. For the first time, people outside the canine unit truly understood. It wasn't just a working relationship. It was a bond deeper than words, stronger than fear, and in Max's case, unbreakable even by death. The commanding officers took notice. Discussions began about increasing resources for canine training, improving medical care for retired service dogs, and even establishing a new honor, one that would permanently recognize canines who gave their lives in the line of duty. The military wasn't just remembering Max, they were changing because of him. Back home, Daniel's mother struggled to process everything. Some days, the attention was overwhelming. Other days, it brought her comfort to know that her son and his beloved Max had left behind something so meaningful. One morning, she received a package at her doorstep. The return address was unfamiliar, but as she opened the box, she gasped. Inside was a beautifully crafted wooden plaque. At the top, a metal engraving read, "Bonds that never break." Below, two images had been carefully etched into the wood, one of Daniel in his uniform, standing tall and proud, and beside him, Max, sitting alert, his eyes full of focus and love. Beneath their images, a single quote was inscribed, "Side by side in battle, side by side in rest." Tears welled in her eyes as she traced her fingers over the carving. There was no sender, no note, only this quiet, powerful tribute. She placed the plaque on the mantel beside Daniel's medals and Max's folded flag, running her hand gently over the symbols of their service, their sacrifice, and their unwavering devotion to each other. One evening, as the sun set over the cemetery where they lay, a small group of soldiers gathered at Daniel and Max's grave. There was no official event, no ceremony, just comrades who had come to pay their respects. A canine handler knelt beside the headstone, his own German shepherd sitting quietly at his side. The dog sniffed the ground, his ears flicking as if sensing something deeper than what the human eye could see. "They say dogs don't understand death," the handler murmured, looking down at his partner. "But I think Max knew exactly what it meant." Another soldier nodded. "He didn't just serve, he chose." A silence fell over them. The wind moved through the trees, carrying the distant sounds of the base where new canines were being trained, where new bonds were being formed. One of the soldiers pulled something from his pocket, a small patch from his uniform. embroidered with the insignia of the K9 unit. He pressed it gently against the grass before standing up. "Rest easy, Max," he said softly. "You did good." As they walked away, the K9 at the handler's side turned back for a moment, staring toward the grave, ears perked, and for just a second. One fleeting moment in the fading light. It almost looked as though another figure was sitting there beside the headstone, watching, waiting, loyal, always. The days passed, but the story of Daniel and Max never faded. Their names were spoken in training camps, in quiet conversations among soldiers, in the hearts of those who had witnessed their final moment together. At the base, a new recruit asked his superior about the statue that now stood near the K9 unit. The officer looked at it. Daniel standing tall, Max at his side, both frozen in time. "That's a reminder," the officer said, "of what it means to trust, to love, to never leave a partner behind." Daniel and Max had been buried side by side, but they had never truly left. Because legends don't die, loyalty never fades. And somewhere beyond this world, a soldier and his K9 walked together, forever.